Welcome, everyone. And in this presentation, I just want to quickly review the principles of motor learning. And for anyone going into teaching, coaching, training, or even those in the strength and conditioning field, it's important to understand the differences and the different things that contribute to skill learning and improvement. And all of the principles of motor learning help with making any learned skill a permanent change in performance. And that is what the definition of motor learning is. It is that permanent change that happens in any learned skill. And there are several things that contribute to that permanent change. And this is where we get the principles of motor learning from. So number one, there is the principle of interest. And this is, it has to do with the student's attitude towards what they're learning and for the most part, how that learning takes place. So just think, if you're not interested in something, you're not going to put much effort into participation, into being engaged, and therefore you're not going to learn much. So the principle of interest emphasizes the fact that we need to find ways to gain students' interest in a topic, in a subject, in a skill, in a game, whatever it is that we're focusing on. Most students are not motivated. Most students are uninterested in sports. It's those rare few athletic-minded type students that are really going to be eager and desiring to learn. But how do you get the other students to buy in, to be motivated, to be interested in something? And so the more interest a student has, the more and the better the learning is going to take place. Number two is the principle of practice. And we've talked about allowing practice time when students are learning skills over and over and over again. And this is not only just allowing time to practice, but to practice the motor skills correctly and do so in the essential environment which is going to contribute to the learning taking place, which is why it's important that once we introduce a new skill, we do give students a significant amount of time to practice the skill over and over and over again. Then we have the principle of distributed practice. And basically, this is where the student participates in the activity or demonstrates the skill during short periods of time. And those short periods should be somewhat intense because the more intense they are, the more focused, the more engaged, the more effort the student is putting into it, the more learning is going to take place. So short, intense practices also contribute to motor learning. Also, there's the principle of skill specificity, and this also relates kind of to skill transfer. But the principle of skill specificity states that a student's ability to perform one motor skill effectively is independent of his or her ability to perform other motor skills. And so we need to focus on specific skills and specific students as well, because every student is different. Every student is going to learn differently and learn at their own rate, but we need to specify how the skill that they're learning is going to contribute to the bigger picture of the ultimate end goal. Then we have the principle of whole to part learning. And this is where the student demonstrates the ability to either learn part of the skill, which could be more effective, or learn the whole skill in its entire setting. And depending upon the student, this can be helpful or harmful. We always talk about progressive learning. Sometimes students learn best progressively, but there are rare students who need to see the skill in its entire setting, so the whole part of it. But the principle of whole to part learning kind of goes back and forth and says, depending upon the student, depending upon the learner, it could be more effective to break it up in parts, contributing to that end whole, or sometimes the student might need to see at the beginning how the skill is actually applied in a game situation. That whole is what we're thinking about. Then we have the principle of transfer, which of course says one skill can transfer to another skill, and students need to understand this. And this needs to be deliberately emphasized in instruction. So when students are learning one particular skill, make a list, identify how many other sports or activities or games that this similar skill can help the student participate in, which is why we don't necessarily in physical education instruction don't build on these skills and tap into some prior experiences. Most of the time, teachers assume that students have learned something before and that learning has already taken place, motor learning, meaning it's a permanent part of the student's knowledge. That doesn't always happen. And so we need to really emphasize and be repetitive about teaching the students how one skill can transfer to another. And as they move to a different sport or activity, take a step back, reflect on what they've learned before, and show them how that easily transfers over. Then we have the principle of skill improvement. And now there is this continuum of learning motor skills, which goes from least mature first and then continuing to a mature stage of learning and performance. Now, how fast this happens depends on the developmental level of the student, how often the student practices, the intensity of those practices, and how much application the student understands. And so the principle of skill improvement basically states all of these things taken into consideration will contribute to the overall learning and understanding of how to apply a particular skill. Then we have the principle of feedback, and we've talked about this before. Feedback is a very critical component of instruction because not only do we need to be able to model and explain to students progressively, thinking about pedagogy, going back to that, the science of teaching, not only do we need to explain things to students in the most simplistic, basic way, we also need to do so correctly so the student isn't learning improper skills. And then once they start developing that muscle memory, it's more difficult to break them of a negative habit than it is to just teach them effectively from the beginning and give them that feedback on a regular basis. And then we have the principle of variable practice. Now, there are generally two types of practice. We have block practice, where the student performs a single skill over and over again with repetition until improvement is noticeable. And then we have variable or random practice, where the student experiences different challenges or multiple skills in more complex situations. So in variable practice, one skill is not repetitively done over and over again, but more so it's a bigger picture. It's more challenging to the student. So understand these principles of motor learning because you are likely to be tested on them. These are just 9. There are some others, but these are just some basics that relate to teaching physical education instruction and developing students' understanding on how to participate in not only individual and dual sports, but team sports as well. Next, let's just take a look at some differences between teaching and coaching. We haven't had a time to talk much about this. Now, although there are several differences, there are also several similarities. And we can compare these by developing what's called a Venn diagram and listing some of the qualities and expectations of the teaching profession and then some of the qualities and expectations of the coaching profession. And from here, we can identify the commonalities between the two. And this is where some of the role conflict issues come into play, as well as those changes of perception that are so difficult to separate when students or parents have this idea of what physical education should be. Again, we have to start thinking outside of the box. We need to be more creative thinkers. We need to think more instructional or instructionally when we're thinking about teaching as opposed to coaching. Now, most coaches and athletes, or those who are considered athletically minded, have a difficult time understanding that there are distinct differences in the approaches for coaching and for teaching because most of their physical education experience revolved around the coaching aspect of things. Now, those individuals who are athletically minded want students to understand sweat, pain, rigorous workouts, high levels of competition, and all the things leading to that. And there's nothing wrong with that, but physical education instruction is not meant to expose students to these things. So, for example, we can begin a list and just say for teaching, and make a list of those things that are related to teaching. Teachers focus on skill development. The teaching profession is guided by national standards for teaching. And physical education instruction is open to all students. And for teaching, the focus is on instruction and development. And we can continue this list on and on and on, and you're going to have to do that in a moment. And then we can make a list of things for coaching. For coaching and for coaches, the focus is on skill enhancement, not necessarily development. Coaching also has national standards that guide the coaches. Unfortunately, most coaches are not familiar with these national standards, nor do they even consider applying them. For coaching, the expectation is for students to try out for the sport and hopefully be selected. So it's kind of selective. And then coaches also want to focus on competition. A coach must win in order to demonstrate success. And so we have kind of this compared list. I mean, and like I said before, there's tons and tons of additional differences. And we look at this list and we find one commonality between the two, which is the national standards. Both teaching and coaching have national standards that guide instruction and development for either the students or for the athletes. And so comparing this list and looking at this list, we can develop several other expectations. And so your job is to continue the list and do just that. Develop what I consider an extensive list of qualities and expectations for both teaching and coaching. And this can be developed on a Venn diagram, a chart, or even just a simple listing. And once you have created this extensive list, I want you to highlight the similarities. And let this list be a starting point, the one that I just gave you an example for. Let this be a starting point for you to begin. Identify as many components, expectations, and responsibilities of each profession that you can, because this is going to be one of the first pages in your resource packet. So be sure you spend some significant amount of time getting this developed. So go ahead and get started with that list, and that's all I'm going to give you for now. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.